Alright, so today we're going to talk about three concepts. VO2 max, or VO2 peak, the Fick equation, so how VO2 max and VO2 peak are explained physiologically, and lastly the Stringer method, which is adding a little bit of research to those concepts in order to help us make some calculations about what's going on inside the body. So first of all, VO2 max and VO2 peak. Well, we have to come back to the idea of our graded exercise test. A graded exercise test is done to incrementally increase the work so that your body responds and incrementally consumes more and more oxygen. And eventually, when the intensity becomes hard enough, you reach a peak or a plateau. So oxygen consumption levels off. If this is a graph, and this is the graded exercise test, and this is your percentage of VO2 consumption, as it gets harder, you get to 50%, and eventually you see this. Now there's a couple of things to consider. First of all, you don't know what 100% or what your VO2 max is until you measure it. So during the test, this is unknown. Secondly, when you're measuring oxygen consumption, you don't always get this nice peak. Sometimes people are exhausted and they just stop before oxygen levels off. So here we have two different terms, VO2 max, which is the gold standard, versus VO2 peak, which is when you're pretty sure that you've achieved VO2 max, but you can't say it with 100% certainty. Now in order to determine that, you use what's called different criteria. So four very common criteria which will be tested on are, number one, a plateau in VO2. When you increase the power output. So because it's typically done on a bike, what this means is that you increase the resistance, therefore you increase the power output, but the VO2 stops to increase. Second criteria, RER greater than 1.1, sometimes, depending on who you ask, 1.15. When you're talking about athletes, you tend to be able to go a little bit higher, so you can set the criteria 1.15, but a lot of different tests are just 1.1. The bottom line here is, if you remember about RER, above an RER of 1.0, we're seeing contributions that are measurable from the anaerobic energy systems. So at this point you're in pain, usually your muscle is burning because you have that anaerobic contribution. Third criteria, heart rate max. Another tricky one. So get into equations about estimating heart rate max when we talk about estimating VO2 peak. But for this case, if you know what somebody's maximum heart rate is, you use that. If not, you can also look for a plateau in heart rate with an increase in power output. And lastly, you could estimate heart rate using a heart rate equation and then try to get within 10 beats of that. Okay, number four, volitional exhaustion. So, the person works so hard they cannot work anymore. The way you measure this would be, for example, with an RPE scale. So, when somebody says, I am now at 20 on a 20 scale, or I am now at 10 out of 10 on a 10 scale, they are at volitional exhaustion and they stop. Another way you can measure on the bike is a decrease in power output, so they actually slow down their cadence. So that's volitional exhaustion. VO2 max is if all or at least three of these four criteria are achieved. VO2 peak is if only maybe one of these criteria is achieved, but you still feel like it's a good test. Usually they've given a maximal effort, there's no other indications that something was wrong, that something was stopping them, and you achieve a fairly high VO2. So once the test is over, you can determine what 100% of VO2 is because you've been measuring oxygen consumption throughout. For example, just to give you a quick number, let's say at 50%, you're at 2.5 liters of O2 per minute, which means that at 100%, you have somebody who's at 5 liters of O2 per minute consumption. And once you've completed the whole test, you can figure out that 2.5 divided by 5 is equal to half, okay, which is equal to 50%. And that's going to be important later on. So that's a graded exercise test, that's VO2 max, and those are the 4 criteria. The next concept is the Fick equation. We'll get to that one in a second.